Today's webinar is titled Strategies for Selling Less, the Future of Sustainable Business Practice. Our presenter today is Dr. Sandy Rothenberg. Sandy is a professor in RIT's Saunders College of Business in the Department of Management. She received her PhD in organizational behavior from MIT's Sloan School of Management, her MS in technology and policy also from MIT, and her bachelor's in bioengineering from Syracuse University. Sandy's research focuses primarily on corporate social responsibility, ethics, and corporate environmental strategy and management with a focus on printing and automobile industries. Her research has been published in such journals as Sloan Management Review, California Management Review, and the Strategic Management Journals, Journal of Industry Ecology, Journal of Management Studies, among others. Sandy is also the director of the Institute for Business Ethics and Corporate Responsibility, whose mission is to support research and teaching that focuses on the interdependent relationship between business and society. Today, Sandy is going to share the secret of selling less, but making more. Take it away, Sandy.
Thanks, Sally. Welcome to everyone. I appreciate you taking time out from your busy day. Hopefully you're eating lunch or something by your computer, doing something else, getting all your stuff done. So what I want to tell you about today, I do like questions. So if you have a question, feel free to post it and it will be forwarded to me. So this research that I want to talk about in this model, I started getting interested in it probably about 20 years ago when I was at an automotive plant. And while I was at the plant, I was talking to someone from Waste Management who was in the plant helping them basically take care of their waste. And the person from Waste Management was really distressed. And the reason he was distressed is he had just been told he has to help the plant reduce its waste. And he didn't get how they could have a business that did that because he made money with more waste. And that moment sort of stuck out in my mind, and I've always come back to it because it reminded me that industry makes money off of making more. And we'll talk about a business model that, I see the list, and there are some of you that are in businesses that do this already, where you make less, but you still make more. So first I want to start with where most of the thought is in management. And my guess is in this case, industry might be ahead of where academics is, and I'll say where I've seen the literature move forward. But so most of the discussion about environmental management is what's called eco-efficiency, which is you can improve the environmental performance by maybe using fewer chemicals, using less energy, making more efficient packaging, making more fuel-efficient vehicles, making alternative fuel vehicles that produce less carbon dioxide. And my guess that all of you work for a company that's doing something like this. And what's great is there's sort of this win-win discussion out there which says you do this and it's also good for business. And it is in a lot of cases, not always. So it leads to cost savings. So everyone is probably aware that Walmart is doing a lot to reduce the amount of packaging it uses. And this, yes, helps the environment, but it also saves them a ton of money. This is very common in manufacturing where you try to reduce the amount of energy or water or chemicals, and it reduces your manufacturing costs. The other thing it can do is allow you to differentiate yourself. And this benefit varies depending on the company. We did some research where we looked at whether being socially responsible led to improved financial performance. And what we found is that it did so, but it did so more for companies that either weren't very innovative or companies who were in industries where there wasn't a lot of differentiation. And what that points to is that the ability to differentiate yourself by doing good has some value, has some financial value. And it's more value for companies that don't have other ways to differentiate themselves. And then you can also create barriers to entry. Then you have other, so you can create barriers, for example, you know a regulation's coming up, and you can make the only washing machine that meets, for example, Energy Star requirements or something like that. And it prevents other people from entering the market. And this positive relationship is supported by research. Overall, if you look at all the research that's been done, it says, yeah, being green or being good leads to better financial performance. At the very least, it's a wash. That's, you know, at the very least, you're not going to get hurt too much. And so that's sort of where we are in a lot of contemporary management thought. And I'll say the exception to this, from what I've seen, is there's a lot of work being done in Europe on what I'm talking about today. So European academics and industry seems to be a little bit in front of the pack on this issue. And the problem, and why this guy at Waste Management really sparked something in my mind, is that this is not going to get us where we want to go. So you all know that, you know, that impact is population times affluence times technology. That's sort of the traditional model. And so if we have an ever-growing population, we don't want to reduce our affluence, so everyone's relying on this technology. And the problem with that is that there are limits to technology. It can only get us so far, particularly with the population growing. The other thing they've found is that there's a rebound effect. So if you make something more efficient, people tend to use it more. And I don't think my husband signed in, so I can use him as an example. So he bought a lot of these energy efficient light bulbs. And once we bought them, we put up all these lamps all over that are on all the time. And I say, well, that's not very efficient. And he says, but they use almost no energy. So that's an example of a rebound effect. And we'll see what happens when I go home today. But another study showed that, for example, this was a study in UC Berkeley that they looked over fuel efficiency for a long time, from 1966 to 2001, and they found there was a rebound effect. So the more efficient the vehicle, the more people tended to drive. And in the long term, it was about 22%. Now this rebound effect is stronger with people who have less affluence. As you can imagine, you know, they're more elastic. People who have a lot of wealth are less elastic in how they respond to that. Okay, so if this is a problem, if we're not getting there through eco-efficiency, how else can we do it? We have to deal with consumption. In a way, looking at this model, it's sort of how do we deal with this affluence, so affluence doesn't mean more stuff. So, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And the model I'm talking about is called servicizing. And you might, you know, hear product service systems, eco-efficient servicizing. In the chemical industry, it's called chemical management. The idea is that the transaction is no longer about a product, but a function. And you meet that functional need by a combination of products and services. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is mostly seen in business-to-business markets. It's also increasingly seen in business-to-government markets. So if you go to conferences in this, there's a lot of people from the government who do procurement who are interested in this. But the idea here is in business, you have a very strong incentive for increased operational efficiency, for reduced costs, and suppliers often have a lot of knowledge about their customers' systems and how to make them more efficient. So a supplier firm will help customers use less of their product while making a profit. And I'll just give you one example. So here's an ad from Lexmark. This is their web page, you know, where they're saying, print less, save more. And at first you'd say, well, why would a printing company want to convince people to print less? So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. One is a chemical company, Gauge. Another is a paint company, PPG, and a third is Xerox. And I think, yeah, so, and I don't know, we might have even people from those companies. So, and there's, what I'll say is what they were selling before, what they now sell, and what the benefit is. So Gauge is a company that sells chemical blends for automotive paint operations. And what they switched is they switched their model to provide an effective paint operation. So that's what they do. They go in and they sell an effective paint operation now. As a result, they have much fewer solvents and cleaners, lower VOC emissions. PPG, this is, again, I said I mostly do printing and auto, so those are my examples. They sell paint for automotive paint applications. Their new model is we manage an efficient and quality paint operation. And for some automotive manufacturers, they actually run the whole paint shop. It goes to that extent. And as a result, you use a lot less paint. Xerox sells copiers, printing, supporting products, toner, and they have really switched their business model to manage an efficient document management process. And as a result, you go into, for example, they'll go into a company and you'll see all the desktop printers. They go in and they provide, instead a few multi-purpose printers, reduce the number of printers, reduce the amount of print being done in the area, reduce the amount of paper, toner. So there's a lot less energy used and a lot less solid waste. So these are the 3 examples, and I think that might give you a good idea of the type of model I'm talking about. And this is a big challenge. This is not a minor thing for a company to do. And so here's an example from a supplier. From the company standpoint, it's a very big cultural shift. Later I'll talk about how, we'll talk about car sharing. And automotive companies have been very slow to get into car sharing. And I think part of it is because it's a cultural shift. They sell cars. They don't sell service. They're not a rental company. So it's a big cultural shift. It's very difficult as a supplier to get people on your staff used to the idea they want to help take product out of the system and not try to sell more. For the customer, it's also a shift because they have to rethink their relationship with their supplier. You know, so one quote, I think it was mostly, there was an entrenched way of thinking. The biggest thing was just to convince them, you know, to convince the customer that you were trying to buy the system and not the product. And one of the big challenges in this is trying to figure out the price. And someone at Harvard has done a little bit of work looking at contracting under these relationships. But there's a lot more work to do. So, you know, and it's also a cultural shift because for these to work, often you need much more of a win-win. It has to benefit both parties. And it requires a different type of relationship.
Sandy, we have a question from Matt. How would a company mitigate risk in shifting their culture to a greener model?
Okay. What you've hit on that is one of the biggest problems with this model. So greener model doesn't necessarily have to mean service sizing. So I'm assuming that you're asking about this particular model. And what's interesting in the few examples I've given you, they've tended to be in areas where if they didn't switch, they would have lost out. Either the customer was threatening to move to a different supplier if they couldn't reduce costs. Maybe their products were being commoditized. They just couldn't make money anymore. So for these type of people or companies, it was a risk, but it was a risk they needed to take. I think what you're getting at is there's two issues. One is if you're offering a product service system, does it threaten your product line? And the answer is yes. And that's why it has to be done intelligently. You have to think about, you have to be able to build long-term relationships with companies. I'll talk about some of the other benefits it gives you. One, I didn't put the quote in there, but you know, one of the Sloan guys, he told me, well, my job is to put myself out of business. Ideally, that's not what your job is, and if we'll talk about different ways you can sort of minimize that risk. But it's absolutely a risk, but part of the risk is that you're developing a new competency in services, and you make money from these services. So there's an answer, you do this, but I think you have to do it intelligently and try to think about how you can extract value out of these services and make those the moneymaker. And Xerox has been done very good at that. It's a huge, they've really shifted to a service organization, and I think the risk is actually if you don't do it enough. If you sort of don't provide good services and you're also threatening your product base. That's maybe a bigger risk. So, but we can come back to that if I haven't answered that well. But let's talk about how you manage this change. First is you have to build off existing strengths. So, you know, this is, you might have certain abilities that you have. Engage, they knew paint, they understood paint, they knew chemistry. So whatever services they offered was based on their knowledge of chemistry. You also have to redefine the basis for profit. And this is part of answering Matt's question, is you've got to make sure that the profits are, that the contracts allow both parties to win. So if you enter into a new contractual agreement, which is only to the benefit of the consumer, then you will put yourself out of business. It has to be a mutual partnership. And there's different things you can, different ways they do it. You contract based on, well, we're going to only purchase this much. If you go over it, then it's up to the supplier to pay for it. Sometimes these have stipulations for reduction. So we only purchase this much with the agreement that next year we're going to purchase less. Not necessarily pay less, but purchase less. So you're going to help us save money. Most of these contracts find a way that both parties benefit from the savings. Another one is a fixed fee. So this is saying, this is the service we provide. I'm going to pay for the service. And the other thing is just having like a shared savings. And a lot of people mix things with, they mix shared, sorry, I got distracted for a second. They mix service and volume. So you have some payment for service and some payment for volume. Okay? The next thing you do is you communicate it. And this, I can't stress enough, this is a cultural change. It has to be supported from the top down. And I just want to say, I see some comments in the discussion board. And I'm just wondering, let me come back to them because these are really good questions. That's what I was getting distracted about. So, and we'll get back to that because I think government, for example, Matt, has a very important role, and they're trying to figure out what that role is, at least the EPA is. And Thomas, I think Thomas asked a question. I think that's a good comment. So I see them, and we'll get back. Okay, so then you have to change the incentives. So I talked to one of the people at Gage, basically told me that the person heading the change said it was a total failure. And what he realized is they didn't change the incentive system. The salespeople were still being compensated based on how much they sold. And so you have to figure out how you change the incentive system so that the salespeople are now incentivized to create good customer relationships, to develop that long-term relationship, to provide good service. And the other thing is you want to think about acquiring new skills and knowledge. So to do this, you probably are not going to have all the skills and knowledge you need. Xerox, for example, I'll just go back to that because I used that example before, has gone out and purchased companies that, for example, have expertise in IT because that's critical to their services. So if you look at this model here, you can look at green development capabilities and sort of attributes. If you have very low green development capabilities and you also don't have a lot of the stuff that's needed to do this service-sizing model, then you are going to have to acquire new companies or a partner at the very least. And then highlight the environmental advantages. If you do this, though, it's got to be credible. Differentiation only works if it's credible. If you're not credible in how you're differentiating your product, it's going to be a failure. Okay. So, can I take a question now, Sally?
Sure.
Okay, because I want to go on to, we're sort of going to switch a little bit. So Matt had asked, is there a role for government in this? And I actually did go to an EPA conference on this topic. And they were really trying to figure out what is their role. And that's why I think procurement in government is sort of taking off, because they figured that really as a huge customer, they can have a lot of influence. And so that was a big, so that's why that's going in that direction. Europe is actually much more forward, and one of the things I want to do is do more research on this and just find out what's going on. But they actually, in particular Denmark, have more government involvement in this. And the easiest way a government can incentivize is to make sure the externalities are brought internal, so that the price of products truly reflects the problem. So people sort of are incentivized to reduce consumption. But there's other things you can do too. I mean, the government does this, for example, by maybe having a high occupancy vehicle lane, or something. There's different things like that. Okay, so we'll go back. So who can do this? Not everyone can do this. And I got a comment from Tom sort of indicating this isn't the right time for me to do some of these things. And I think it's true. I think, first of all, you've got to have a customer demand. And all three examples I gave you, the customers were basically threatening to leave if they didn't figure out, how they could do it better. And so you've got to have a customer demand, and they've got to be willing to pay. It might be, hopefully they won't pay more, but they have to rethink what they're paying for, and that is not an easy shift to make, to communicate to them. I think if you have an existing service and technical base to build from, it's a little bit easier. So someone like Gage, who sold a huge range of chemicals, they were able to, although they reduced the amount of chemicals in the paint room, as they created this close relationship with their customers, they were able to find other markets. And that was pretty important. So they overall may have even increased the number of chemicals they were selling by increasing the market share of the chemicals in that plant. But that's because they had the knowledge and technical base, and they didn't really have to buy a lot of new knowledge. You have the ability to build close relationships with customers, and this is also a benefit of this model. So if you do this right, you will have a closer relationship. And as you go in, new business opportunities will come up. So if you're into printing and you all of a sudden are supplying all the printing, you might then take over other printing functions or other information management functions in a company. This is also good because it creates barriers to entry. So if you're the first one in there and you are doing all the chemical management, it's actually now, or all the paint, it's actually a huge cost now for this customer to switch because they're relying on you to do their paint operations. So it's a huge benefit. And and you want to think about that when you're developing your contracts. So most of you know about, I'm blanking on the name, the carpet Interface. So Interface was one of the, the companies known for this type of model because they created carpet squares, and you could just, so instead of building a big carpet, you built a square, you bought squares, and then if something got dirty, you wouldn't replace the whole carpet, you just replaced a square. And the model didn't work at first because they realized that it only worked if they locked in the customers, if it was a long-term relationship. And then finally, when they realized this and they changed their contracts to longer-term contracts, they not only were able to develop these closer relationships, but financially work better. And that leads to this opportunity to increase market share. And if there's market share outside of your current customer base that you can also gain, that makes it even more attractive. Okay.
Sandy, we do have a comment from Phil, who said that it's an interesting argument for this model. The deeper partnerships actually lead to discovery of new opportunities, and by partnerships, he means closer relationships, deeper knowledge, and competitive.
Absolutely, and I think the companies who do this well are willing to shift based on this new knowledge. So, I'll go back to the paper example. You might, and I'll bring some other examples in later. You might go in just selling printers, but as you get to know the company and you're sort of almost a partner in the company, as you do this, you begin to see there are other opportunities. I'll give another example. There's a printer. Printers are basically, print is a commodity. So it's very hard to be successful as a printer nowadays. This has been a huge issue also with outsourcing. And so this one color printer, this person who's like printing for companies, he basically switched more and more to a service model. And he was printing out menus for a company. And he realized that with the menus, he was getting all the information they needed on what they needed to order. He had the ingredient list. All he needed was sort of some projections. And he saw this, and he took advantage of this, and now he also manages their inventory for them. But it takes someone who's willing to see those opportunities. So I think you're right in that.
We have another question.
Okay.
Do you want to take another question?
Sure.
This question comes from Lynn, Do you account for the cost savings to the company based on centralized negotiation and point contacts versus multiple LOB sales contacts?
I think part of it can be from that. I mean, the other part of it is behind this model, the model is not just we're going to change how we negotiate. However, the more that certainly can contribute. The savings, and not all of these are going to lead to savings, I'll just say that. In the business-to-business model, that is a huge motivator. But the savings come from fundamentally changing the product that you're offering. So while, yeah, the more you are able to do these types of centralized negotiation, I think you can probably get some savings that way. But I don't know if it's any different in this model than in any other model, except for the fact that in order to implement a product service system, you inherently have to get closer to the customer, which might lead to these type of negotiations you're talking about. So I want to move on to the B2C market. And I think this is a harder sell. I think, business to business, it makes sense. People are motivated to save money. Companies can help save money. It's great. But can we do this at a consumer level? And I think that's harder. Some examples that came up, Charmin. Every time I see the Charmin ad, I get all excited. You can see what a nerd I am. But you see the ad, and it's the guy, the bear, and his kid, and look we can use less with Charmin. You don't have to use as many squares. And that's really, in a way, a servicizing. It's not quite a service, but it is reducing consumption. And it actually has not met with a lot of success. This hasn't been people don't buy the Charmin because they can use less. SodaStream's another example of an area, that I think is a great model. You don't go out and buy lots of soda. They're giving you the capability to make your own soda. Okay? So, and we'll talk about these again in a second. And you can think of, you could think of other examples probably. But it's very hard. It's harder to change the behavior of lots of individual consumers than it is a few companies, or even hundreds of companies. And changing the behavior, if you win the behavior of one company, that can lead to a huge benefit for you. Changing one consumer is not going to really give you a lot of money. And then the motivations for consumption is more complex. So, when you buy a lot of people who buy toilet paper aren't thinking about how can I save the most money. There are other issues. So, similarly, if you're buying a soda, I know people who are like, this is my Coke, this is my Pepsi, I will not drink anything else. So there's something else. And the other thing is, it might get harder to get customers to change behaviors. If you have the boss coming in saying, listen, we're partnering, this is true in all three examples I thought of, where the boss came in and said, listen, we're going to use less solvents. That was a hard sell in a paint shop. Everyone thought solvents is what led to higher quality. But if you have the boss coming in and forcing you to do it, you change. You can't do that with consumers. So the question is, where might this work? Okay? And I see a question out of the corner of my eye that I'm going to wait on it because I think it's going to, it's sort of related, so I'm going to hold on it. And I think what you have to realize, before I go into where it might work, I'd like to talk about the notion of disruptive technology. So, there's incremental technology and there's disruptive technology. Disruptive technology, it creates a major positive disruption in the way society functions. So some examples, You know, Sun Microsystem Workstation disrupted the market for mainframe computers. The Xerox plain paper copier disrupted the market for offset printing. You know, now everyone could just copy it. You know, you don't have to go all the way to the printer. Canon's desktop photocopiers disrupted Xerox high-speed photocopying market. So these are things that really disrupted the way society functions. Now, you could say these aren't like truly, you know, mind-blowing changes, but they're just examples. What's important to know about disruptive technology is that it almost always starts out as performing worse on our traditional standards of performance. I don't know if I have another arrow here. There we go. So here, here's a disruptive technology, and here's you know, sort of the incumbent technology. And when the disruptive technology first comes in, it's low. You know, so for example, with with the example I gave before with Sun Microsystems, PCs didn't have all the functionality, memory, power that a mainframe had, okay? But they offered other things that some people were attracted to. And this goes, eventually though, they surpass the performance of the existing technology. So the question I'm trying to ask is, where are the markets in this area? If product service systems are a disruptive technology, and they will perform less, what can we do? How can we get, where can we find these markets? And I think we have to find specific markets for them, for the consumer market. So one could be in developing countries where they really maybe have less of a demand for certain performance factors. One example, this is sanitation. So right now there are people developing what's called dry toilets. So if you go to countries like Haiti, or you know, that's where I know they're working with some people there. They don't have a sanitation system, and they're developing what's basically a product service system with dry toilets, where then they remove the waste and maybe use it for fertilization or whatever. So the service is to help maintain these stations, and the product is fundamentally changed. Now, this is not going to give all the functionality that we might be used to with our fancy toilets. Or if you've been to Japan, they're super fancy toilets. And in fact, you know, there is an issue. So if they don't look high-tech enough, for example, you know, in Haiti when they were doing some market tests, they didn't like that they looked too rustic, for example. But that's not to say that it's not going to be successful, and it's not to say that eventually that might be a better way of doing sanitation. Maintaining huge sanitation systems is extremely expensive for society. So that's one example where it's sort of lower performing, it's a fundamental shift, and you find the market where just having a sanitation system of any type is useful. And another one is car sharing. And I'll go back to collaborative consumption. So car sharing is, you know, if you've lived in an urban center, you've seen it, but it's basically where, you know, you sign up for a program and there are cars parked around the area, and you sign out a car. Now, it doesn't perform as well because you don't always have the car. The car you want, you know, maybe you'll need the bigger car, isn't always going to be there. It's not your car. You're not going to be able to have your nice little, you know, setup however you like in there, and your CDs. Well, I guess we don't use CDs anymore, but you know, there's performance-wise, it's not as great. But for urban centers, where it does perform is amazing. People don't want cars. The big thing there is, where do you park? So this solves all that problem because they always have a place to park. And so this is another example where you look for the market where reductions in the traditional performance standards are acceptable. And then eventually it might be that we all do car sharing. I mean, if you can get the system or a large portion of us, okay? The other thing that's coming up, and I don't talk about it a lot, and I know, we have probably 15 minutes left. There's a huge, so this is an example, leasing is an example of where it's working at the consumer market. There's also another huge area called collaborative consumption. And this is where people basically share things together. There's companies that maybe can facilitate this. My students are always thinking of business opportunities, and they thought about, if you go to a neighborhood and you go, we're going to maintain a set of tools for your neighborhood, and you just use those tools. Different regions are doing it by themselves. They're saying, listen, I don't want everyone to buy a chainsaw. Listen, I have a chainsaw. If you want to use it, come over, and you find some way to do it, okay? The other area is clothes. I've always thought, I think a great business model, instead of me buying a gazillion clothes, none of which, totally work, you go and you have an expert and they buy you certain clothes, or the seasons change, you change them out. It's a high-value service, but you're paying less for clothes overall. So there's different things you can think of in that area. For any of these models, you need what's called customer co-creation. And this is where you have what this means is that the customer, it's only green if the customer interacts and behaves in the way that makes it green. So I know, for example, Nike has done some stuff on this where people can design their own sneakers or something. That's an example that's often used. But for all of these things, what we're talking about is fundamental behavior change. So the process of developing these new service-sized models means you have to really understand where the customer wants to be involved and how much they're willing to be involved, and how you can help. I saw hand-holding in the corner from one of the comments. How you can help them be involved. Because maybe they don't know that this is, that they can do it a different way. Or maybe they need help thinking how to do it. If I'm doing car sharing, what is it gonna, what does it mean I have to do in terms of planning, for example, so I have the car when I need it. And so I think it does change how we relate to our customers. And you bring customers, and these collaborative consumption models almost leave out the whole firm. It's all customers doing it. The customers are all organizing among themselves. So, if you can get in there and sort of provide value in that process, it's a business opportunity. So I want to end, and then we can go to questions, on sort of a broader issue. There's a wonderful book by John Ehrenfeld. He also just came out with a new one, but I can't remember that one. His first book is Sustainability by Design. He just came out with a new one with Andrew Hoffman. And they talk about a lot of these things. And I think what this is really going to need is we have to stop thinking about ourselves as creatures that are driven to acquire goods. And that the more goods we have is how we can determine our well-being. you know, if consumption is the act of trying to meet our needs, what are our real needs? The basic needs, you know, security, care, love, all the things that make us human. Consumption, just for the sake of consumption, is addictive, and we get into this cycle where we're just constantly consuming, but it's not clear it's meeting our basic needs. And for the consumer, we can't just, you know, think of the environment as a source where of resources to give us pleasure. You know, that we are part of the world. And what he calls it is surviving versus flourishing. And I really like that distinction, that the first one is surviving. But we don't want to survive. We want to flourish. We want to have lives that are full and beautiful. And I think, you know, thinking about this world flourishing it was very helpful to me. Let's bring it back to business. Okay. If we say the attainment of this human condition, happiness, love, meeting these basic needs, is the primary measure of success, that's not a problem. Business is great at understanding people's needs and meeting them. And I think there is a bunch of untapped need out there. People are so busy meeting the needs that lead to surviving and also filling this consumption addiction that we've forgotten about the real needs. And I tell you, if someone came up with a product service systems that gave me more time with my kids, and I tell you, a lot of people would do that too. What value that is. And, you know, these are the type of things that I think business can do it. They just have to realize that there are unmet needs, and they're needs that will lead to a society that's flourishing and not just surviving. So, and I think this model is a way to do that, where you rethink what you're offering, and what you're offering is now a function to help meet certain needs. It's not for every company. And I think that's partly why we see a lot of startups getting involved in this area, because it's a hard change to make. For example, SodaStream. You know, that's a new person coming in, totally changing the relationship with, you know, refreshing beverages or whatever. Similarly to Zipcars, you know, or car sharing. They're mostly startups. Now some rental companies are getting in. So, you know, that's something to think about if you have an existing company. You know, I think, you know, how can you make this change less costly? So that's all I have on that. On the note of flourishing and a call for business to meet real needs.
So we can go back to, there were a couple comments and questions that maybe we should go back to. Phil commented on disruptive technology, and that's an excellent example that speaks to the role of government involvement.
Right. Oh, actually, you're absolutely right. And I'll give you an example. So with these dry toilets, I'm trying to get some students down to Haiti to do some market research. And I mean, what is the incentive for people to do this, right? Because the market is poor. It's a high risk because it's a new market. And so we were talking about, are there government money to help maybe start installing this new sanitation system? So I think you make an excellent point. I think government helping sort of people take risks in these new markets is a great use of government funds.
And then one other question and comment from a business to individual consumer perspective. Would a drive to increase the quality and price of goods, which then drives a service model, create a further stratification of socioeconomic status.
So there's a drive to, let me just, I'll scroll up so you can see this. The assumption there, I'm trying to find this.
Will only those with means be able to purchase and maintain goods, while those with lower socioeconomic status continue to consume in an unsustainable way?
Well, I would actually flip it the other way. I mean, I could see a society where you don't need goods to be rich. You need function. So I would think that just like other types of products, that these product service systems would decrease in time, you know, as they're developed. And they are more expensive. I mean, I haven't seen an example where it's more expensive. So, you know, car sharing, for example. Now, you might say, what I thought your comment was getting at is, does it mean that only rich people will get to have stuff? You know, and maybe that would be the case. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, as long as everyone's meeting their goals. You know, that the only rich people will really have their own, you know, every single lawn tool and chainsaw and all this stuff, and other people will be sharing it. That could be an option that happens. But the product service systems in themselves aren't more expensive. Hopefully they're cheaper. Because I don't think doing it more expensive will be successful.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sandy, for sharing your thoughts on corporate sustainability. That's all the time that we have for Q&A. Any additional questions can be emailed to ritalum@rit.edu or tweeted to @RIT_alumni with the hashtag me RIT webinars, and we'll direct your questions to Sandy. Note that all participants will receive an email from us in the next few days with a link in today's webinar with the recording.
Well, I'm just going to chip in. I know I'm interrupting Sally. I don't know if they can read that. I thought I'd be able to write down, but I encourage all of you to go to the Institute for Business Ethics website. We have Ask the Professor. You can pose questions. There are resources. There's some great videos on green marketing you can use. Look at it's centers.scb.rit.edu/ethics. And also, if you contact me, I can send you the website.
So please note that our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, October 9th, and features John Roberts, the 2013 Distinguished Alumnus of the College of Science, and his spouse, Jesse Roberts, and they're presenting on who to thunk it, inventing and naming your brainchild. If you haven't registered already, please look for an upcoming email invitation to join. So I want to thank Dr. Rothenberg for presenting today and all of our participants on the phone today. So thank you, and hopefully you'll come and visit RIT soon. Have a good day.